In 1973, 24-year-old Estelle Crane walked onto the sun-baked, cracked earth of a foreclosed dairy farm in rural Tennessee and made a decision that would alter the agricultural landscape of the entire county. She was a quiet, observant young woman, possessing a stillness that most people mistook for timidity. The property was in the hands of a bank liquidator, a man who possessed no auctioneer's gavel, no rhythmic chant, and no patience for the tragedy of a lost family farm. He was simply there to sign papers and collect cash for whatever rotting assets remained scattered across the overgrown pasture. Among the rusted plows, the collapsed silos, and the skeletal remains of tractors sat 13 dilapidated feed wagons. They were massive, iron-framed beasts, originally designed to be hauled through muddy fields to deliver grain to dairy cattle. Now, they were monuments to decay. Their tires were dry-rotted and sunk deep into the mud. Their wooden beds were splintered and gray, colonized by moss and insects. The steel frames were coated in a thick, blistering layer of rust that flaked off in the summer wind. To anyone with a pair of eyes and a lick of common sense, they were industrial corpses. They were scrap metal, and poor scrap at that. Estelle did not see scrap. She walked the length of the line of wagons, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust. She knelt in the dirt, wiping away a layer of grime from the main steel beams of the undercarriages. She tapped the metal with the handle of a heavy screwdriver she carried in her pocket. The sound that rang out was not a dull, hollow thud of rotted iron, but a sharp, resonant ping. The rust was entirely superficial. The bones of the wagons were solid, forged from high-grade steel in an era before manufacturers learned to cut corners. She stood up, brushed the dirt from her denim trousers, and walked over to the folding table where the bank liquidator sat sweating in the afternoon heat. Beside the liquidator stood a local heavy equipment dealer, a man whose entire livelihood depended on knowing the value of steel and machinery. He was a large, imposing figure who spent his days buying cheap and selling dear, and he viewed the agricultural world through a lens of absolute, arrogant certainty. Estelle looked at the liquidator and spoke in a clear, unwavering voice. "I will give you $1,500 for all 13 feed wagons, exactly as they sit." The equipment dealer burst into a loud, booming laugh that echoed off the empty tin walls of the abandoned dairy barn. He slapped his knee, shaking his head in disbelief. The few other farmers who had lingered on the lot turned to look, their faces twisting into expressions of pity and condescension. They had been trading machinery, working this land, and fighting the weather since before she was a thought, and they believed they knew exactly what they were seeing. They saw a naive, foolish young woman throwing away a small fortune on a mountain of useless iron. The dealer wiped a tear of amusement from his eye and pointed a thick, calloused finger at the wagons. "You are buying a graveyard, little girl," the dealer said, his voice dripping with mockery. "That is scrap metal, and poor scrap at that. You will spend more money paying a tow truck to drag them out of the mud than you will ever get back from a junkyard. You are throwing your money into a bottomless pit." Estelle turned to look at the man. Her expression did not change. There was no anger in her eyes, only a deep, impenetrable calm. "I am buying a foundation," Estelle said softly. "The rust is just on the surface. The steel is true." She handed the liquidator a cashier's check, signed the release forms, and walked away from the sound of the men chuckling behind her back. She did not look back. She had work to do. Now, let me explain the world Estelle Crane lived in. Rural Tennessee in the early 1970s was a place bound by tradition and conventional wisdom. Farming was a stationary endeavor. You bought a piece of land, you cleared it, you planted your seed in the spring, you prayed for rain in the summer, and you harvested in the fall. If you kept bees, which many farmers did, you kept them in a row of white wooden boxes at the edge of the woods behind the farmhouse. The bees were an afterthought, a minor hobby meant to produce a few jars of honey for the pantry and perhaps a little extra to sell at the local market. The conventional wisdom dictated that bees lived where they were placed, and they foraged on whatever happened to be blooming within a 2-mile radius of their hive. When the apple blossoms faded in May, the bees simply had to wait for the clover to bloom in June. If there was a drought or a gap in the blooming season, the bees went hungry. They consumed their own honey stores to survive, their populations dwindled, and their pollinating power diminished. That was simply the way of things. It was the natural order as far as the local experts were concerned. But Estelle possessed a secret weapon, an inheritance of knowledge that the men laughing in the dusty lot could never have comprehended. Her father, a quiet and deeply thoughtful man who had passed away 2 years prior, had not been a conventional farmer. He had been a master beekeeper, a man who possessed an esoteric, almost mystical understanding of the natural world. He did not view bees as honey factories. He viewed them as the vital, living engine of the entire agricultural ecosystem. He understood that without the bee, the blossom falls barren to the earth. Without the bee, the orchard yields no fruit, the berry bush remains bare, and the pumpkin vine withers into dust. Her father had never possessed the capital to buy a large farm of his own, but he had possessed something far more valuable, a meticulous, scientific mind. He had spent his entire life observing the intricate dance between insect and environment. When he died, he left Estelle no money, no land, and no grand estate. He left her a collection of well-worn, handmade woodworking tools and a stack of leather-bound journals filled with decades of handwritten observations, blooming calendars, and radical theories about agricultural pollination. I must tell you about these journals because they were the blueprint for everything Estelle was about to build. Her father had written extensively about the fatal flaw of stationary beekeeping. He called it the bloom gap. He noted that in any given geographic location, the nectar flow was not continuous. It came in explosive, brief waves. First the tree fruits, then the wildflowers, then the late-season vegetable crops. When a stationary hive exhausted the local bloom, the bees starved. But, her father hypothesized, if a beekeeper could somehow follow the bloom, moving the hives across the landscape in synchronization with the changing seasons, the bees would never starve. Their populations would explode. Their health would remain robust, and their capacity to pollinate massive commercial crops would be unparalleled. He had dreamed of a mobile apiary, a fleet of traveling hives that could chase the spring across the state. He had drawn sketches of wagons, ventilation systems, and securing mechanisms. He had possessed the vision, but he had never possessed the means to build it. Estelle had read those journals until the pages were thin and fragile. She had internalized her father's wisdom, absorbing his philosophy not through lectures in a classroom, but through years of working silently beside him, learning to diagnose the health of a hive by the pitch of its hum and the smell of the air around it. When she looked at those 13 rotting feed wagons on the foreclosed dairy farm, she did not see the failures of the past. She saw the realization of her father's unfulfilled dream. She saw the vehicle of her future. The subsequent 12 months were a masterclass in solitary discipline, brutal physical labor, and unwavering patience. Estelle arranged for a local farmer to tow the 13 wagons to a small rented barn on the outskirts of town. The farmer charged her nearly all the money she had left, and he shook his head the entire time, muttering about the foolishness of youth. Once the wagons were lined up in the weeds behind the barn, Estelle went to work. She was entirely alone. The labor was immense. She began by stripping the wagons down to their steel frames. She used heavy crowbars and sledgehammers to break apart the rotting wooden beds, hauling the splintered debris away by hand. She bought an old, used arc welder and taught herself how to use it, practicing on scraps of iron until she could lay a bead of weld that was smooth, strong, and impenetrable. She spent the entire winter beneath the wagons, grinding away the superficial rust with a heavy angle grinder, breathing in the dust and the smell of hot metal. Her hands became permanently stained with grease and iron oxide. Her muscles ached with a deep, bone-weary fatigue that followed her into her sleep. But the land remembered her father's wisdom, and the steel remembered its strength. As she worked, she transformed the wagons. She welded heavy, reinforced steel crossmembers to the undercarriages to support the immense weight they would eventually carry. She replaced the dry-rotted tires with heavy-duty, military surplus truck tires capable of absorbing the shock of rutted country dirt roads. Then came the carpentry. Following the intricate diagrams in her father's journals, she built entirely new beds for the wagons using rough-sawn, weather-resistant cypress wood. But these were not flat beds. They were complex, multi-tiered platforms specifically designed for the housing and transport of honeybees. She built long, raised hive stands down the center of each wagon, allowing the wooden bee boxes to sit off the floor, safe from moisture and vibration. She designed and constructed heavy wooden securing rails, equipped with heavy-duty mechanical ratcheting straps, ensuring that dozens of hive boxes could be locked down tightly, preventing them from shifting or tumbling during transit. The most brilliant aspect of her design, however, was the ventilation system. Transporting bees is a highly dangerous endeavor. When a hive is closed up and moved, the bees panic. They generate an immense amount of heat, and if the air cannot flow, the entire colony can melt down and suffocate within hours. Estelle engineered a system of louvered vents along the sides of the wagon beds, covered in fine steel mesh. As the wagon was towed down the road, the forward motion forced fresh, cooling air up through the slatted floors of the hive stands, circulating through the secured boxes and keeping the bees calm and alive. It was a masterpiece of practical engineering, born from the mind of a dead man and built by the calloused hands of his daughter. By the spring of 1974, the transformation was complete. The 13 rusted hulks of scrap metal had been reborn into a fleet of pristine, highly functional mobile apiaries. They were painted a stark, heat-reflecting white, with heavy iron hitches ready to be connected to a tractor or a heavy truck. Over the course of that same winter, Estelle had been meticulously breeding and splitting bee colonies, using the techniques her father had taught her, until she had enough healthy, booming hives to populate the first 3 wagons. Now came the true test. The physical labor had been exhausting, but the social and economic struggle was just beginning. Estelle had to convince the local farmers to hire her. She was proposing a service that did not exist in their paradigm. She was not selling honey. She was selling a traveling pollination service. Have you ever wagered everything on an idea no one else believed in? Have you ever stood in the face of collective doubt and held on to a truth that only you could see? Let me stop and ask you something. When the entire world tells you that your path is foolish, where do you find the strength to take the next step? For Estelle, the strength did not come from arrogance. It came from the quiet, undeniable truth written in her father's journals. She began driving her old pickup truck from farm to farm, knocking on the doors of the large commercial apple orchards in the eastern ridges of the county. She laid out her proposal. She explained that for a set fee, she would tow her wagons onto their property right as the blossoms opened. She would flood their orchards with millions of hungry, healthy bees. When the bloom was over, she would hook up her wagons and leave, taking the bees away so the farmer did not have to deal with them for the rest of the year. The reaction was uniformly dismissive. The orchard owners were men of the old school. They looked at this young woman in her work clothes and shook their heads. They told her they already had a few hives out back and that the wild bees would do the rest. They told her they were not going to pay good money for a service that nature provided for free. They whispered behind her back calling her the crazy bee girl who had wasted her money on rusty wagons. The equipment dealer, who still held court at the local diner, made her the punchline of his morning jokes, assuring everyone that she would be bankrupt before the summer solstice. The rejections piled up like dry leaves in autumn. By early April, the apple trees were on the verge of blooming, and Estelle had not secured a single contract. Her money was entirely gone. She was living on rice and beans, and the debt she had incurred to buy the cypress wood and the welding supplies felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. There was a moment, a single evening in the cold spring rain, when the weight of the isolation almost broke her. She stood alone in the rented barn, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof, looking at the gleaming white wagons sitting idle. The collective skepticism of the community echoed in her mind. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps she was just a foolish girl clinging to the eccentric dreams of a dead man. She walked over to the first wagon, her hand resting on the wet cypress wood. The doubt was heavy, pulling at her spirit. But then, she heard it. From inside the secured boxes on the wagon, a low, steady, vibrating hum rose up. It was the sound of 100,000 bees, warm and alive, waiting for the spring. It was the sound of potential energy. It was the sound of life. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and remembered her father's voice, quiet and steady in the bee yard. She tightened her jaw, turned away from the door, and resolved to fight harder. The breakthrough came not from a place of vision, but from a place of desperation. A few miles outside of town, an older farmer named Silas owned the largest apple orchard in the region. Silas had recently expanded his acreage, planting thousands of new trees in a dense, modern configuration. But he had made a critical error. He had cleared the surrounding woods to make room for the trees, inadvertently destroying the habitat of the wild native pollinators. The previous year, his trees had bloomed beautifully, but the harvest had been disastrously small. The blossoms had fallen off unpollinated. He was facing financial ruin. Estelle found Silas standing in his orchard, staring grimly at the tightly closed buds on his trees. She did not pitch him a grand theory. She simply stated a fact. "Your trees are going to bloom in 4 days," Estelle said, standing beside him. "You do not have the bees to set the fruit. If you do not pollinate this crop, you will lose the farm. Let me bring my wagons. If your yield does not double from last year, you do not owe me a single dime." Silas looked at her, then looked at the vast, silent orchard. He had nothing to lose. He agreed. 3 nights later, under the cover of darkness, Estelle began the great movement. Bees must be moved at night, when the foragers have returned to the hive and the temperatures are cool. She hooked the first heavy wagon to a rented tractor. The massive military tires crunched over the gravel as she pulled it out of the barn. She drove slowly, carefully, navigating the winding country roads, feeling the immense weight of the iron and the wood dragging behind her. She positioned the wagons precisely in the center of the orchard, dropped the stabilizing jacks, and opened the entrance gates on the hives. The next morning, the sun rose, warming the air, and the apple blossoms burst open in a spectacular display of white and pink. And from the wagons, a dark cloud emerged. Millions of bees took to the air, their collective hum sounding like a low-flying airplane. They descended upon the blossoms with a ferocious, starving energy. They worked systematically, moving from flower to flower, transferring the golden pollen, setting the fruit. Silas stood at the edge of his field, his jaw slack, watching a phenomenon he had never witnessed in his 60 years of farming. The air was thick with insects. The efficiency was staggering. When the bloom ended 2 weeks later, Estelle returned in the night, closed the gates, hooked up the wagons, and towed them away, leaving the orchard silent once again. The subsequent summer was a period of tense waiting. But when autumn arrived, the results were undeniable. Silas's orchard produced a harvest of such staggering volume and quality that it broke county records. The branches of his trees were bowed to the ground, heavy with massive, perfectly formed apples. The local agricultural extension agent came out to take photographs. The news spread through the farming community like a wildfire in dry grass. The undeniable harvest was the catalyst. Suddenly, Estelle Crane was no longer the foolish girl with the rusty wagons. She was the keeper of a vital agricultural secret. The following year, her phone did not stop ringing. The farmers who had mocked her now begged for her services. Estelle expanded her route. She pulled her wagons out of the apple orchards in late April and towed them down into the valleys where the massive commercial blueberry farms were just beginning to flower. The bees, having built up their populations on the apple nectar, were at peak strength, and they pollinated the blueberry bushes with devastating efficiency. When the blueberries finished, she moved the fleet to the vast fields of seed crops in high summer. And in the cool days of early autumn, the wagons rolled into the lowlands, parking beside the sprawling pumpkin patches, ensuring massive, heavy gourds for the October harvest. She had successfully defeated the bloom gap. Her bees never starved. They rode the wave of the seasons, forever moving into fresh pastures. The subsequent 2 decades were a masterclass in slow, methodical expansion and unwavering discipline. The 1980s and 1990s saw massive shifts in the agricultural economy. Small farms were swallowed by larger corporate operations. The demand for massive, guaranteed pollination skyrocketed. Estelle did not take out massive loans to buy shiny new equipment. She stayed true to her frugal, self-reliant nature. As she earned money, she slowly rebuilt the remaining 10 rusty feed wagons she had purchased on that dusty lot. She welded, she cut, she painted, and she populated them with new hives. Her fleet of 13 white wagons became an iconic sight on the rural highways of Tennessee. When people saw the wagons rolling through the dawn mist, pulled by heavy trucks, they knew the seasons were turning. Estelle hired a small crew of dedicated workers, teaching them the quiet, deliberate methods of her father. She paid them well, and she demanded perfection. Her business, Crane Mobile Apiaries, became the most sought-after agricultural service in a 3-state radius. She owned every wagon, every truck, and every hive entirely free and clear of debt. It was during this period of undisputed success that the acknowledgement scene occurred. It was late summer, and Estelle was sitting on the tailgate of her truck near a massive field of blooming clover, recording notes in a leather journal that matched the ones her father had left her. A heavy, late-model pickup truck pulled onto the dirt shoulder and parked behind her. An older man stepped out. His hair was gray, his shoulders were slumped, and the arrogant swagger of his youth was entirely gone. It was the equipment dealer. His own business had suffered terribly in the agricultural downturns of the late 80s, as farmers stopped buying new machinery and learned to repair the old. He walked slowly toward Estelle, his eyes scanning the pristine white wagon parked in the field, listening to the deafening, healthy roar of the bees. He stopped a few feet away, took off his cap, and wiped his forehead. He looked at the heavy steel undercarriage of the wagon, recognizing the brutal, indestructible iron frame beneath the fresh paint. "I recognized the axle hubs when you passed by my shop this morning," the dealer said, his voice quiet, devoid of its former booming volume. Estelle closed her journal and looked at him, her face as calm and unreadable as it had been decades ago. The dealer swallowed hard, struggling with the weight of his own humbled pride. "I thought you were a fool, Miss Crane," the dealer said. "I stood in that lot and I laughed at you. I told everyone you were buying a graveyard. I told them you were throwing your life away on scrap metal." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I was entirely wrong," he said. "You built an empire out of the trash we threw away. I have watched you do it for 30 years. I just want to know. How did you know? How did you see what none of the rest of us could see?" Estelle did not gloat. She did not smile a victorious smile. She simply spoke the truth that had guided her entire life. "I did not look at what they were," Estelle said softly. "I looked at where they could go. My father taught me that the earth provides everything we need if we have the patience to follow its rhythms. You saw rusted iron. I saw a vehicle for the spring. The rust was only a memory. The foundation was always strong." The dealer nodded slowly, absorbing the profound simplicity of her words. He reached out a heavy, weathered hand. Estelle took it, and they shook hands firmly, a silent transfer of respect from the old establishment to the quiet master who had redefined their world. He turned, got back into his truck, and drove away, leaving her alone with the hum of the hives. Let me jump forward now, to the twilight of her career. The narrative of Estelle Crane does not end with a sudden retirement or a massive corporate buyout. She refused every offer to sell her company to the massive agricultural conglomerates that eventually came calling. By the time she reached her late 60s, she was a deeply respected elder in the community. The local agricultural university sent students to study her methods. She sat on advisory boards, though she rarely spoke unless she had something essential to say. The 13 original wagons, the very same iron frames she had dragged out of the mud in 1973, were still in operation. The cypress wood had been replaced a few times, the tires had been changed, and the paint had been reapplied, but the core foundation remained exactly the same. They were a testament to the enduring value of quality materials and meticulous care. She began passing her knowledge down to her nephew, a quiet young man who possessed the same observant stillness she and her father had shared. She did not teach him by giving him a manual or sending him to a seminar. She taught him by making him stand in the bee yard at dawn, listening to the pitch of the hive. She taught him how to weld a clean seam, how to secure a load for transport, and how to read the subtle changes in the weather that signaled the opening of the blossoms. She handed him her father's original leather journals, now accompanied by dozens of her own, creating a continuous, unbroken chain of ancestral wisdom spanning nearly a century. Now, let me explain the ultimate truth of this history. We live in a world that is obsessed with the new, the immediate, and the disposable. We are told that success requires massive debt, shiny new technology, and the aggressive conquest of nature. We are told to listen to the experts, the dealers, the men who stand in the dusty lots of life and confidently declare what is valuable and what is worthless. But the story of Estelle Crane proves the exact opposite. True, lasting mastery does not come from following the crowd. It comes from possessing a deep, esoteric understanding of your craft. It comes from the willingness to perform grueling, solitary labor in the shadows long before the world is ready to applaud you. It comes from the frugal, disciplined repair of the broken things that others have discarded. The experts told her that bees must remain stationary. She put them on wheels and chased the spring across the state. The community laughed at her for buying scrap metal. She turned that scrap metal into the very infrastructure that saved their farms from ruin. The dealer said to sell the rusted wagons for junk. She kept the wagons, she rebuilt the foundations, and the land remembered her labor.